The Black Book of Communism, one of the largest, most blatant distortions of history.
In the last century, socialism and communism killed 100 million people.
Communists killed 70 million people in China, more than 20 million people in the Soviet Union, not including...
death tolls contained in the book are the single most quoted anti-communist source in the world.
This book details the atrocities of past so-called communist regimes and is the primary source for a lot of people who claim communism killed 100 million people.
A lot of the 100 million stuff comes from the big Black Book of Communism, which was deliberately
A part of what makes history so contentious is that it has become heavily politicized, and for a good reason. Very few things speak to the viability of one's political theories as much as trial and error does. A state that successfully implements an idea can be a proof of concept, while another that fails, or causes some other form of disaster, can serve as a cautionary tale. As a result, history is the ideal battleground for propaganda, whether it is the historian themselves intentionally lying, or an institution greater than them, like that of a state, oversaturating the media with certain narratives. The Cold War soaked both. The USSR is without a doubt a state that has received unfair misrepresentations in history. Several claims that were once treated as unquestionable have since been challenged by serious scholarship. For example, it was long asserted as settled fact that the Holodomor was a centrally planned genocide with a clear intent to exterminate Ukrainians as people. While the famine itself is undisputed, historians such as Arch Getty and Stephen G. Wheatcroft have challenged the claim of proven genocidal intent, causing even the biggest proponents of the idea that it was a genocide, like Robert Conquest, to redefine their positions. It was also widely believed that Stalin personally directed every arrest and execution during the Great Terror. Archival evidence shows instead that the arrest quotas were often initiated and expanded at the regional level, with local officials pushing repression beyond central directives. It's possible to go further, but the point is that it's possible to challenge misconceptions, and historians of the revisionist school have done very important and excellent work on this matter. But recently, on the internet, the left has become oversaturated with people who go beyond this in a process that can only be described as intellectual self-infantilization. In this video, we will go over the example of the Black Book of Communism. Most people who have stumbled into this video are no strangers to this book, but in short, it is a 1997 political anthology that set out to catalogue and quantify the crimes committed by regimes that identified themselves as communist throughout the 20th century. It was primarily written by the French historian Stéphane Courtois, who also served as its editor, with contributions from several other scholars. The project was published in France by Robert Laffont Publishing, with no evidence of direct state sponsorship, but it emerged very clearly out of a specific post-Cold War intellectual and political climate, particularly in France, where debates over the legacy of communism, Marxism, and the French left were especially intense after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The stated purpose of the book was twofold. First, it aimed to document repression, mass death, and political violence under communist governments, presenting these as systematic features rather than historical accidents. Second, and more controversially, it sought to frame those crimes as morally and analytically comparable to those of Nazism. This latter aim is most explicit in Courtois' introductory chapter, where he advances the now infamous claim that communism was responsible for approximately 100 million deaths worldwide, and argues that the crimes of communism have been insufficiently condemned relative to those of fascism. What matters now is that the Black Book of Communism is no longer treated as a serious or authoritative work in contemporary scholarship. Multiple contributors have publicly renounced Courtois' conclusions. The work has not become a standard citation in academic journals or serious historical debates. In practice, it has been quietly dropped from mainstream scholarly use, surviving more as a cultural reference than as a research text. This is largely because the book makes little effort to do original historical work of its own. Instead, it functions primarily as a compilation and reinterpretation of existing estimates, often selecting the highest, harshest, and most controversial figures available, stripping them of context and summing them into a single rhetorically potent number. In that sense, it is not a source you meaningfully cite so much as a viewpoint, an attempt to produce a symbolic figure designed to settle an ideological argument rather than illuminate historical reality. As a result, outside of fringe internet spaces, the Black Book of Communism is rarely used as a serious argumentative foundation. Ironically, its most visible afterlife today is not among its original defenders, but among online leftists, where it has experienced a brief resurgence as a kind of boogeyman. It has become a convenient shorthand for dismissing one of the most common criticism leveled against socialism. But socialism killed millions! By treating that entire line of argument as if it rests solely on this one demonstrably weak book. The problem with this approach is twofold. First, it is often disingenuous. Many claims about mass death under socialist or communist regimes do not actually originate from the Black Book of Communism at all. Assigning those claims to the Black Book retroactively is an easy way to discredit them without engaging the grain of truth behind their claims. Secondly, even when addressing the Black Book itself, it is frequently critiqued so sloppily that leftist responses end up misrepresenting its contents. Over time, this has led to outright hallucinations about what the book claims. What makes this whole situation especially strange is that, despite how decisive the topic is made to seem, the stakes are actually quite low. Even if a book were fully accurate on its own terms, it would still fail as a knockdown argument against socialism. There is a categorical difference between deaths that occur under regimes that call themselves socialist, and deaths that are caused by socialism as an economic or political system. Beyond ideology, these states shared far more concrete features. They emerged in poor, agrarian, war-ravaged societies with long histories of famine, civil conflict, foreign invasion, and mass mortality. In many cases, it is at least as plausible to argue that socialism tends to arise when mass death is already endemic, rather than that mass death reliably follows from socialism itself. Conversely, suppose the opposite were true. Suppose the book's headline numbers were entirely wrong, and the real figure were not 100 million, but 30 million or 20 million. That would not by itself rehabilitate socialism either. If one still believes a causal relationship exists, is it acceptable to follow an ideology that has killed such a number of people? In other words, the moral and political evaluation of socialism does not hinge on any single aggregate death toll. Both sides can, and often do, spin either conclusion through more abstract arguments about its causation. For the internet left, at best, this means they uncritically parrot things. At worst, it amounts to deliberate misinformation, because it is simply easier to defeat a caricature than to engage with what the book actually says, and more importantly, what it actually fails to prove. For a good example, I'll use this video by Hakim, where he claims to refute all arguments against socialism. In the section titled Guerrillians, he talks about the claim that socialism killed 100 million, and after a brief statement about deaths under capitalism, he makes the conversation about the Black Book of Communism. Let us begin.
And the main author, who's the only guy that stands by it to this day, pretty much, had this fascination of getting to the 100 million mark. So he would even randomly add 2 million deaths here and there. He would see a number and be like, you know what, this can have a couple of extra zeros on it. Yeah. That's at the level of honesty we have.
This stems from a newspaper article published on October 31st, 1997. It is an interview with Nicholas Worth, who points out that Courtois uses 20 million instead of 15 million. Reading the book, Worth is spot on. That is about accurate. With roughly 1 million in executions, 11.5 million in famines, 800,000 in deportation-related deaths, 1 to 1.5 million deaths in gulags, and about 400,000 deaths in decossacization, the total is about 15 million. 5 million short of the number presented in the beginning, so the book fails to justify its figure. Although it is not the case of Courtois specifically making these numbers up from thin air and adding them here and there. In several instances, Courtois cites Robert Conquest, but doesn't go with his higher estimates of casualties. Courtois could have easily arrived at the 20 million figure by trusting Conquest over Courtois' more conservative estimate, though that estimate was the reasonable one, since Conquest's numbers are largely outdated by now due to the opening of the Soviet archives. Michael Ellman points this out in his article.
counting non-births, like the birth rate goes down, or fertility rate, excuse me, and as a result, all those people who would have been born, but the woman decided to, use contraception and not have those children, all of a sudden those are considered deaths.
This is absolutely not the case. Here's a passage from a book saying the opposite as we estimate the deaths in China. When estimating deaths, we're trying to explicitly not count the deficit in births.
Counting Jews who were murdered by Nazis and fascists as deaths of socialism.
I went over the 15 million figure from earlier and how Conquest's estimate could easily push it up to 20. At no point does the book count Jews murdered by Nazis as victims of communism.
And finally, which I find the most hilarious and the most mask-off moment, they count Nazis, dead Nazis, as victims of communism and as part of the death toll. I don't know about you, but to me, the more dead Nazis, the better. So this one, I really...
While Nicholas Wirth's chapter on the Soviet Union notes that, according to one Western study, nearly 1 million German prisoners of war may have died in Soviet captivity, he's doing it to illustrate what he perceived as harsh camp conditions. In the introduction written by Stéphane Courtois, the reference is deliberately scaled down to tens of thousands of German soldiers who suffered murder or death in the Gulag after being taken prisoner from 1943 to 1945. This lower estimate is presented not as part of the core tally of victim of communist repression, which focuses on civilians subjected to purges, famines, deportations, and the Gulag system, but explicitly within a list of Soviet war crimes alongside acts like the Katyn massacre, mass rapes, and plunder in occupied territories. The Black Book of Communism is a weak academic work with serious methodological problems, but the key point is that the scholarly discussion around it looks nothing like the internet discourse. J.R. Getty criticized the book for collapsing fundamentally different categories of death, executions, Gulag mortality, famine, disease, into a single moral total in order to sustain a political comparison with Nazism. He didn't deny mass death, he just didn't see treating policy failure as equivalent to intentional racial extermination. Nicholas Wirth himself distanced his archival findings from the book's interpretive framing, rejecting the claim that his figures demonstrated an exterminatory logic comparable to Nazism. From the opposite direction, Michael Ellman criticized the book for relying on overly conservative estimates, while still rejecting Courtois' conclusions. Stephen Wheatcroft, Mark Torger, and Ronald Sonny challenged the book's treatment of famine in one way or another. Ask yourself, why would a historian like Getty spend his time arguing about how to categorize deaths, or whether famine mortality should be analytically separated from executions if the book were really counting non-births as deaths or randomly fabricating figures? Why would Wirth debate interpretive framing rather than denounce elementary errors? The answer is obvious, because it's not an issue. It is made up. The book is criticized as an academic work. A very flawed and biased work, but an academic work nonetheless. Hakim isn't doing anything unusual. It's trivial to look this up and find the same claims repeated across leftist YouTube comment sections and communities, often word for word. These talking points don't come from engagement with the book or its critics. They circulate because they're useful. That alone should raise red flags. They don't bother reading sources or doing any research. A document is either safe or hostile, and once it's labeled hostile, accuracy is no longer important to them. The point isn't to understand or even argue properly, but to shut the issue down as fast as possible. The comment sections tell you everything you need to know. Stalin's spoon, Gorillian's dead. Endless irony, but there is no real questioning of the facts, despite the blatant misrepresentations. Just as one wouldn't arrest a criminal with made-up evidence just because he's guilty, the issues of the Black Book of Communism do not warrant or justify lying about its contents, and only serves to display the dishonesty of the side that does it. This is genuinely worrying, and the only honest term I could think of to describe it is self-infantilization of the left, because this is only one example among many. Maybe more on that later though.